Super Xalaxer was probably my favorite action game that came out last year in 2013. And it was in some pretty good company with two games I really like, Race the Sun and Ridiculous Fishing. And while there's a whole lot of stuff going on in both of those games, Super Xalaxer just kind of has a much simpler main idea it's going for. It's basically just a crowd control game, and as the cute little tutorial demonstrates really quickly, all it is that you control two ships, and one of them is controlled with the mouse, and the other is controlled with the keyboard. And the whole game, a big chunk of the game, is just holding off waves and waves and waves of enemies that get stronger and stronger, using both of your ships at the same time. It's a really cool bite-sized mechanical idea that I think works really well in turning Super Xalaxer into just a really intense action game, which I think is just a really nice, fun thing. It's just a very satisfying challenge that grows at a really nice pace. And here's the first boss fight. The game kind of balances off these two different ways of it utilizes the control scheme in two different ways. There's the long enemy segments that are basically just straight crowd control. You have to be able to bend your brain in such a way that you can know where to keep your ships to be blocking off enemies. A large amount of it is kind of just moving the ships back and forth, but as the game progresses, you need to be better about keeping your ships in specific places and moving your ships towards specific places with the enemies. And also the screen transitions, this transition between levels, I think are really slick. I don't get to show that off perfectly because there's a few editing spots that due to recording mistakes. But all of the screen level transitions are just pristine. It's really cool. And as you can see here, that switches it up between levels. Sometimes you can have both ships going across the entire level, and sometimes they're split into two different areas. But what I was saying was that there's the enemy control segments like this, where it's just straight crowd control, and then there's segments that are just about dodging specific entities with both ships. And those will be stuff like boss fights, where they'll be shooting bolts down at you, and all you need to do is just move the guys in such a way that they can dodge the bullets, which is a very different dynamic from the crowd control. I think the crowd control is a little bit meatier, just mechanically, but the dodging stuff is a really kind of a nice counterpoint to that, and is used to really great effect. Here's the second boss fight. You can see again here. All this one is about is just getting the guys in the right place, so that they don't get hit by the bullets. And obviously there's a lot of wiggle room because you've got regenerating health, which I think is smart, because if the game demanded any more precision than it does, then it would very rapidly become just very frustrating. I'm playing it on hard mode now because I just think it's an even more satisfying challenge, but neither mode goes just ridiculously into demanding very precise motions for the player, which is wise because the control scheme just is so hard to wrap your brain around in certain ways. I think this is a really clever little level design idea here. You have to move back and forth between the two different sides of the screen as the enemy waves swap with the asteroids. You can't really blow up the asteroids, so you have to jump back and forth. And also as you'll see, the frequency with which it splits between the asteroids and the enemies gets faster and faster and faster, which makes for a pretty intense little level experience here. I also really admire the simplicity of the power-up system. When you die, it just goes back to 1, and then you can very rapidly build it back up to level 3, which is the strongest you can get each ship up to with shock frequency. And then once you get to 3, collecting an additional power-up, it gets pretty tough here. Collecting an additional power-up just gives you a temporary super shot, and that lets you clear out enemies when they get really hairy. Here's another just kind of obstacle dodging segment here, and like I said, I don't think these are quite as interesting as the enemy encounters, but I think they make for a nice kind of counterpoint with, because they just require you to move your brain in a different way, and it's sort of another good use of the mind-bending control scheme idea. And now we're moving on into the 4th level. Again, like I said, it's kind of swaps between the split level idea and the combined level idea, and it uses that split to some really clever effects later on. The 4th level is probably the last kind of easier level. It gets really tough starting at level 5 and onward. Although, curiously, I really didn't have any trouble playing through the game again. Once I guess I played it about less than a year ago, and it took me probably a couple of hours to be able to beat the game on normal and hard mode, maybe a little more than that. But this time I beat every level on my first try, except for the last level. It took 3 tries. And there's a little bit of editing that you might have saw at the beginning of this level and such, but that was because of some recording mixes-ups. Here the crowd control is getting increasingly more intense. I also like how the different enemy patterns are subtly different. Mostly you're just kind of moving back and forth trying to wipe out all the enemies, but there still is a kind of subtle difference in how the different enemies move around. And alright, another boss fight. And you can see the common thread here. This is also very directly foreshadowing the final escape sequence that you'll see after the final boss. It's basically the same thing, just a little bit... I think it's a little bit slower. It might be about the same speed, but it goes by pretty quickly, just like all of the boss fights. This reminds me a lot of Solar Striker, which is probably my favorite Game Boy... not my favorite Game Boy game, it's one of my favorite kind of underappreciated Game Boy games. And it has that same very potent kind of forward-moving progression, and just keeps the boss fights brief, gets back to the levels pretty fast. Here they introduce the shooting enemies, which kind of puts a whole new spin on the crowd control segments, and they're again used to some interesting effects later on, but that really forces you to start just like not just moving your guys just back and forth trying to shoot everything. You have to really focus on how you want to move the enemies. I like that they move slower and take more hits. That's kind of a clever way of forcing you to slow down your motions and think about where exactly you put each enemy. This was a level that like stalled me out the first time I tried the game when it came out, and I'm glad that I came back to it and actually beat it, because it's really rewarding and a fun challenge. And you can see the usefulness here of the Hyper Beam challenge, because once you can kind of like get a bunch of enemies on you at once, and then having that extra beam, Hyper Beam ready. Oh, I got really close to dying here, but I managed to salvage it. The planet in the background there is nice. That also reminds me of Solar Striker. There's a little bit of a forward motion in the set pieces, where you're going from outer space to planet to inner planet, that I think is very effective. And here the enemies get super slow, but it gets just really intense with the bullets and the increased hit points in each enemy. They hold on them longer. It's such a simple game, but I keep finding new things to talk about in relation to it, because I feel like it's just a very richly designed challenge. It's like less than 15 minutes long, but everything just kind of moves forward at such a nice pace. I just really admire how the game is put together, and playing it again was very pleasantly surprised that it was as good as I remembered it being. Oh god, the bullets get super hairy here. Reed's made like a ton of games, and I really enjoy his work. Full disclosure, we're kind of buddies online, but this is probably my favorite game of his. I feel like it's just the most richly and maturely designed game he's put together, and I really like how every piece just kind of fits together really naturally. And this boss is pretty clever too. It's sort of a combination of the dodging and the crowd control, where you're just having to kind of bend your brain to move the guys around, because you can't. The way the movement is, you can't just keep them on top of each other like I'm trying to do, because the mouse guy moves faster than the keyboard person, so you kind of have to like jerk the keyboard guy along and keep the mouse guy moving at a more consistent pace. Because, oh, we're moving into a crater here. Cool. This is probably my favorite level of the game, just flat out, because it has one moment that's just completely brilliant, and it'll be obvious when it comes across. It's just beautiful. And I also really like the color scheme in this segment. It's just very intense, and the music is building up as it progresses very naturally as well. I think the music is from the Newgrounds audio portal, and you should be able to find it in a link to the game. Also, here you can see the switching between certain enemies. The enemies on the left here are shooting, and the enemies on the right are just moving fast, and then it swaps between the two. It keeps that swapping thing going, where it forces you to move between the two different styles of play with the two different control schemes, which is just kind of the game's modus operandi. But that's not the super cool thing about the level. That'll come up shortly. But as you can see, it's just getting faster and faster and faster. And it's just a really intense curve. And I like the sine wave patterns as always, and I think that is put to good effect here. Alright, is it? Oh god, here it is! Oh, yes! Oh, that's beautiful! There's so many enemies on the right side of the screen right here. And now on the left side you have to fight a boss. That's just perfect! Oh! And now you do the same thing with the other keyboard. It's just really symmetrical and nice. And that was an unexpected display of enthusiasm, but that is just such a cool little twist. And it's just really clever, and it's so hard to hold back all these enemies on the left side while trying to dodge the boss as well. Oh, that's perfect. Now we're moving on to the last level, and it's also really good, but I think the 7th level might actually be kind of harder, which is interesting, because there's a couple games that do that, like Ikaruga, the second to last level is actually a good bit harder than the climactic level, which I think is kind of partly to do with the game's symbolism and reality, metempsychosis. That's kind of a whole another discussion. But on the other hand, I think it's just kind of a neat little twisted pacing that sort of eases you out of the game from the most intense segments to the more visually intense, but maybe a little bit less mechanically intense segment, like this level, which is just kind of a build-up on the 6th level of just shooting enemies, and now except now it's basically every enemy in the game is being thrown at you. So you're just having to hold back, pure crowd control. It's really clever. And again, I really like how the music is used. I feel like it's a good soundtrack, and it just sounds very consistent, and everything really works together. The warning bar here is cute, kind of a nice throwback to the types of game Reet enjoys. And the final boss is pretty easy, and maybe it goes on a little bit long, but it's fine. I like that he doesn't go and add like big boss patterns like multiple boss phases. I think that the simplicity of this game works better with just like the simplistic boss forms, without like in Hunters, where there's Hunters having lots of his other game having lots and lots of boss phases kind of fits that game's sort of contra vibe. The bosses are kind of almost a breather, so I feel like it's a nice way to pace the game a little bit better. I also really like how this game looks. I just think it's probably his best looking game. And we're moving on into the little Metroid escape sequence. It was kind of foreshadowed earlier with one of the fights, but let's just move through this. It's just kind of a straightforward dodge as many of the pipes as possible, and works really well as a way to wind up the game. I do think that I do wonder a little bit if having like a crowd control segment might have been nicer as the climax, since that's kind of the meat of the game, whereas this is more like a diversion. But I think it works fine. It doesn't completely ease you out of the experience. And it's super intense. Oh god. I think you can just restart the game from here. I don't think you have to redo the whole last level, which is nice. Honestly, it's a very forgiving game, all in all, especially on the normal difficulty. Plus, there's an easy difficulty, so it's designed so that anybody can complete it, which I think is nice. And like I said, I also like how it is structured so that you can, like, it's built like an assault on the planet, so you go from space to the space station straight onto the planet. And there we go, we finished up the game. I talked with Polly, and she said actually that one of their abandoned ideas was that to have one level where the mouse was on the mouse controlled guy was on the left side of the screen, and on the other side of the divide is the keyboard controlled character, which is reversed. And she decided that that was maybe a little bit too mean, and they decided to abandon that idea. So, the rival, that almost reminds me of Panzer Dragoon's Way's final boss, just phrasing it like the rival, which I know is a game Reed likes. It's a cute little last animation, and I think that about wraps up the game. I really like Super Xalaxer. You can find a link to it in the description. Give it a play, give Reed's other games a play. Goodbye.